I haven't talked to our next guest for much too long because I enjoy talking with him so much and I get so much out of his writing too. If you're not reading him, which I find unlikely, but if that's true, you should be. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation. He has written a number of terrific and interesting books, including People Get Ready, and I believe his latest was Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, which he's been on the show to talk about. He has also written a number of great articles lately, and I'd love to talk to him about a couple of recent events, including the candidacies of Bernie Sanders and of Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of some city somewhere, I forget. But I want to start with something else. First of all, John, welcome to the program.
It's great to be with you. I appreciate it as always. I'm a little bit entranced as we speak, so if you hear announcements or any interruptions, do not imagine that you have to get off the rental car bus, okay?
Okay, all right. No, absolutely don't get off. If you get off the wrong place on the rental car bus, you'll never get back.
I know. It's, yeah.
It's, I don't know what it is. But at least you're not in the Atlanta airport, which is the worst of them all.
No. Yeah.
So okay. But
can I tell you something? I'll tell you before we get going.
Yeah.
I was once at an airport in Bamako in Mali in Africa, and it was actually an excellent airport, no problem at all. But if you ever want to hear noise in an airport, that was the full-on experience, brother.
Well,
a festive airport experience.
Well,
in the coolest of ways.
Let me tell you what the Mexico City airport was like changing planes in 1978 in the middle of the night. The most interesting people come out. It's probably completely different then, but man, I saw signs of the human experience I had no idea existed. But enough about that. I wanted to talk about something equally interesting, which is a piece you wrote about a month ago now about the passing of somebody I wish more people had known. And we'll get to Bernie, we'll get to Buttigieg, but Eric Olin Wright was somebody that now he's passed away. I wish I had thought to invite him on the show. Inspirational and fascinating figure to me, and I guess you knew him. Tell us about Eric Olin Wright.
Well, Eric Olin Wright was one of the great public intellectuals of the 20th and the 20th century. He didn't live to be all old, a guy. He passed away in his early 70s, just a little bit ago. But the incredible thing about him was something that he did back in around 1990. And he was already an extremely well-established sociologist, one of the most prominent and well-regarded professors of sociology in the country. And he would go on to head the national associations, all the awards, the standard stuff. But in 1990, when you had some folks wandered around saying that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that you had reached the end of history and that the future would be a, kind of a very centrist liberal democracy in combination with capitalism, really what we came to know as neoliberalism. Eric Olin Wright said, I'm not comfortable with that idea. I'm not comfortable with the notion that with massive poverty and inequality and all the challenges we face as a society, that we should declare the end of history. What we ought to see it as is a pivot point where we come up with new ideas for how to, what he called real utopias. And this concept of a real utopia was talk about the society you would want to live in. That would almost certainly be a democratic socialist or, some sort of more radical vision than the contemporary vision of what a society might be. But it was the idea that imagine a society where your services were delivered, your challenges were addressed, and yet you still had a lot of freedom, a lot of opportunities, and he invited people to think about that. He based a lot of his thinking in Gramsci, the Italian Marxist philosopher who was a great hero of his. But ultimately, he invited people to talk in the current era. And the simplest thing to say is that in doing that, and in the forums and symposiums and books and interviews and all the things that he did over the next 30 years, he introduced ideas to a broad audience, like universal basic income, like what we now talk about as a Green New Deal. And they kind of run down the list of ideas that are current and popular. And you can trace a lot of them back to the work that Erik Olin Wright did, to such an extent that when he passed away, the Prime Minister of Iceland, Katrín Jakobsdóttir, who's really one of the great leaders right now on the issue of climate change, but also on issues of gender equity and building out a new economy, a kind of post-automation economy. She tweeted immediately about what a terrible loss it was. Ed Miliband, who was the former head of the British Labour Party and one of the great thinkers really on how to kind of modernize economic discussions, was immediately saying, "Oh my gosh, we've lost Erik Olin Wright. That's a terrible thing." And so, it's just to give you a sense that his academic endeavor really reached into the heart of debates, especially in social democracies around the world. He was a very important thinker, and he was also just a gem of a guy. He was always on the road, always reaching out, trying to be places where things were happening in all over every continent. And the final thing that he did, which was really cool, was that he made it his mission throughout his career to mentor young women, people of color, people, immigrants and others, with the argument that academia had to open up and kind of break open the doors and invite so many great new thinkers in. When he passed away, you just can't imagine. It happens, I knew him reasonably well. The number of great intellectuals around the world who were flying in the last days of his life, because he did know he was dying, to spend the last hour with him, just talking. And so that's the kind of guy he was.
Well, I was so very touched by, you quote something he wrote in your piece on him in The Nation, writing about, quote, this extraordinary privilege that I had not to live a life of self-indulgence, but to create meaning for myself and others by trying to make the world a better place. And, reading that, I thought, a life where we pursue meaning and purpose is so much more satisfying than a life of short-term, fleeting self-indulgence. But it seems so rare nowadays to find somebody who recognizes that. And I thought, reading your piece about Erik Olin Wright, that John Nichols, I also thought of the William Blake quote line for some reason: everything that is now proved was once just imagined. The idea that the things we take for granted now is something, for example, that a society can do, that a government can do, that a people can do, was once just someone's utopian idea. I love that juxtaposition of words, real utopias. Utopias made real. And the fact is, the entire American experiment was an exercise in real utopia. I mean, Thomas Paine, when he sketched out the idea for what eventually became Social Security, with more to it even than that, that was a utopian idea. The notion of democracy is a utopian idea we may have yet to perfectly realize, but it is one that we're putting into practice. So it all begins with the willingness to imagine a better world, and his willingness to do that I was particularly admiring of. So I was so sorry to see his loss, so glad that you wrote about him. And that, to me, takes me to what I want to talk about, politics now, because we are now in a political moment, where it seems to me people are expanding the scope of the politically possible in ways that many people would have said even a couple years ago were simply not possible. I think that Bernie Sanders' first campaign, which I was privileged to be a part of, did some of that. It's possible. I'm hopeful that his next campaign will do that, but he's not the only person running. Let's start with Bernie Sanders. You wrote recently that the headline was Bernie Sanders is running and America just might be ready to elect a Democratic socialist. Now, why do you say that? You say that his radical ideas that people assumed would have prevented him from being taken seriously essentially your thesis seems to be will prevent him from being taken seriously no longer, that he's a real candidate and a real possibility. Is that true, first of all?
Well, of course it is true. And you know how you know it's true? Because all these other candidates, some of whom, and I'm not going to name names here, but I'm going to say some of whom might be identified as politicians, right? People who might actually make decisions based on whether they think they can win elections. They're all embracing his ideas, right? They wouldn't do that casually. That's not for the fun of it. You do it because you believe it's a viable approach, a way to go at a political run. And so there's that practical insight, right? There's that practical reality. But I really argue it from a different perspective, and I think it's the more important one. And that is that in 2016, when Bernie Sanders ran, people said, "Oh, well, these are radical ideas. They're not going to go anywhere." And besides, he's a 70-something guy from Vermont, a Democratic socialist from Vermont. Who's gonna get excited about that? Certainly not young people. Well, of course, as we know, young people got exceptionally excited by his candidacy. They backed it with a passion, giving him, in some states, as much as 80% of the vote of young voters who came out to cast ballots. It wasn't always that high, but it was often exceptionally high. And so he was just a very successful candidate, especially with people that were thinking about the future. And so if we begin with that concept, if we begin with the idea that people were thinking about the future, got really excited about this guy, you ask yourself, well, why is that? What was it about him? What was his genius, so to speak? And I hate to tell you, I don't think it was Bernie. I don't think it was his personality. I don't think it was, his presentation necessarily, although he's very good at it. And he's very good at staying on message and focusing on things. He's also a guy who really knows how to evolve with the issues of the day to kind of adapt his core values and his core ideals to new challenges, and in a very smart way. So I give him all the credit for that. But the fact of the matter is, I think the reason he did so well is because he was a Democratic socialist. And it's twofold. Number one, I think a lot of people saw that as different and fresh. You've been told forever that's a bad idea. Well, capitalism wasn't looking all that great to a lot of folks. And so suddenly this alternative vision, very humane, rooted in the values that, you see not just in Scandinavia, but also in the values you saw played out in American cities like Milwaukee and Bridgeport, Connecticut, and a host of others that had socialist mayors, through substantial portions of the 20th century. So here you've got this guy who's arguing an alternative vision. And even that, though, I wouldn't argue was the key to it. My sense is the key to it is what's happening right now in America, in our circumstance. And that is that we are 30 years into a globalization revolution. It's changing everything about how we relate to the rest of the world, and basically how we frame out and organize our lives. We are 20 years into a digital revolution that's really changing everything about how we frame out and think about how we communicate, how we're going to communicate, what we're going to do in the, in the coming years to interact with one another. We're 8 to 10 years into an automation revolution that's going to change everything about how we work, how we, structure our lives. I mean, to some extent, we can't even begin to describe it. We don't have a long enough show to do that. But people know this is happening. And one thing that they absolutely know is reality is that the old-fashioned jobs aren't going to be there. There will be jobs in the future, but there will be a different kind of job. There may not be as many of them. You may not have to work as long. But very likely, you're also not going to get your benefit package from your job, i.e., you will be much more in a gig economy where, you work for different folks in different ways, piecing together, based off your skills, based off your talents, but not necessarily, the traditional UAW contract with healthcare, vacation, time off, structured hours. If indeed that's the case, if that's where we're headed, if that's what every futurist tells us we're headed toward, well, then don't you need social democracy, right? On a Scandinavian model, or at least a German or British model, where your health care is guaranteed as a right, where there are interventions to make sure that you've got at least access to affordable housing, where transportation is run with an idea toward getting people from place to place without them having to necessarily buy a car. A host of things that you see in, the hellholes of the world, like Norway or Sweden or Iceland, right? Well, the fact of the matter is, I think to an awful lot of people, that was super attractive.
So I think that's so interesting. And again, we're talking with John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation and author. And I have a couple thoughts about that. It's such an interesting perspective. Maybe a couple things to add and get your thoughts about. Number one, when people are existing in a world that seems to be in a constant state of flux, which is essentially what you're describing, 30 years into the globalization revolution, the digital revolution, the job automation revolution, all these things, all these forces seemingly going on around us, so that we're just spinning in this globe of this matrix of externalities, then one thing that remains unchanging and internal, or should, is an integrated set of values, a morality, an ethos. And so if a Bernie Sanders comes along, and I mean, I do think personally that what I called the meta campaign, his lack of seeming skill at the sort of optics of politics, I think worked in his favor. His refusal to.
I totally agree.
Yeah,
I 100% agree.
I think it all speaks to, when the world is changing all around you, what is eternal is a sense of values, a sense of right and wrong, good and bad, and what it takes to build a just society. And I think Bernie offered that. And if he can continue to show that he offers that, and that's a quality in short supply in others, I think that gives people something to cling to, even if they don't know how they feel about universal basic income or some of the other ideas and theories out there, that they know, well, yes, this is a value system I can live by. Everybody who wants an education should be able to get one. Nobody should die. Healthcare is a basic human right. Nobody should die because they can't get access to it. We could go down the list, but, we deserve a livable planet. People deserve a job if they want a job. These are fundamental values, and they reflect underneath them, underlying them all, is the belief that every human being has worth, and that collectively, as a society, we can do good for one another. And I think that gives people purpose and hope.
It does. Well said. And I think so. This is where let's take it that next step, as you and I often do in these conversations. The future, as Joe Strummer said of the Clash, is unwritten. There's this great line: "The future is unwritten." It wasn't necessarily only his. Many great thinkers have suggested this. Claude Levi-Strauss, the anthropologist, suggested that he hated when somebody asked him when in history was the golden age, because he said, well, that suggests that the golden age has passed. Mm-hmm. Or if somebody asked him, when in the future, what will the golden age look like? And he said, well, that's no good either, because that means that, it's someplace far in the future. And his line was always, the golden age is in us, i.e., we can make the golden age now. We can make that better society now. And sometimes we may have to do so, right? Because if we simply leave ourselves to the, kind of the whims of the market or the whims of politicians and of wealthy people, they may not watch out for us, right? They may not be inclined to build that better society. And so they may want to just profit off things. And so when you have somebody like Bernie Sanders, who for decades has identified as a democratic socialist, not something you do as a career goal,
right,
usually in American politics, who stayed very, very firm to that, and who also spends a lot of time educating about it, i.e. saying to people, look, you need to know that this works in Denmark. You need to know that this works in Norway. You need to know that this works in Germany. You know what I mean? He is a scholar, and that's one of the one of the things he's undercredited for. This is a guy who actually reads, meets with people, basically conducts a kind of constant symposium on solutions to the challenges facing society, and he updates it. His interest, if you look at his announcement of candidacy, he talked about robotification and automation in there, and where jobs are going to be in the next 20, 30 years. So this is, this is a guy who has a set of very, very firm values that well state, and yet is ready to start, wrestling with the future. Now, why that's important is, again, to go back to that Joe Strummer line, the future is unwritten, right? Go back to Claude Levi-Strauss, the golden age is in us. Put those two together, what do we get? We get to a concept, I think a very appropriate one, that is, we don't know exactly where we're going. It's not clearly charted. And so if we are going to get someplace, we have the opportunity to make it good for us. But the only way we make it good for us, for the great mass of us, is to make sure that those people who are in power are inclined to be on our side, i.e. that, whatever question comes up, how do you deal with automation? How do you deal with the universal basic income question? How do you deal with, a digital revolution, with AI, with all of these things, with all the changes in our workplace, with all the realities of a gig economy and everything that's coming at us? How do you deal with that? Well, it's very simple. You deal best with that by having people who share your values and your ideals in positions of power and who actually have your back, who care about you. And I think it's a simple reality. And it doesn't mean that Sanders will be the best candidate in 2020. We'll see that. That's to be defined. But it does mean that he will be one of them. There's no question of that. And it also means that he, I think, established a framework, a set of ideas for what we might expect in the next president of the United States. And what we might expect, what we have to expect, is someone who will say to the tech companies in Silicon Valley, to the multinational corporations of the world, you don't get to decide. We're not throwing this to the quote-unquote market, which is always a false construct. I mean, the market is, whoever's on top and then uses their power to stay on top, often through manipulation of political processes and the economy itself. No, you don't get to do that. We're going to do it based on popular sovereignty. That means everybody gets to vote. We're going to do it with an eye toward caring for those who have been historically disenfranchised or left on the sidelines of progress, not invited in. We're going to invite them in. We're going to create a model that basically says that the future should be defined by economic and social and racial justice, by concern for the planet, and by a willingness to err on the side of peace rather than war. It's not a very long agenda there, but the fact of the matter is, I think that if you strive for that, the likelihood is you're going to get a society that most of us would want to live in.
Well, I agree with everything you just said, John, and I think it's extremely well stated and very important. But it also speaks to me to an idea I've been struggling with, I've written a little about, want to write more about, but the idea that the left in particular, the American left, and because we debate what that word means a lot. For the purposes of this discussion, I mean everybody to the left of like a moderately liberal Democrat and left, that the left really needs to to make what you describe happen, which I think needs to happen. I feel that the left needs to restructure its relationship with political leaders. I think it has to stop looking, we collectively have to stop looking for the next charismatic figure who's going to take us
right
out of our problems. I think no matter how charismatic or not, I think we need to look to our leaders as colleagues or comrades, if you want to use that word. I had a great conversation on this show with Representative Pramila Jayapal about that, who comes from a background in activism. But, we need more leaders. And I believe, by the way, that I agree with you. Let's see what the campaign shows us about Bernie vis-a-vis the other candidates. One thing I do believe about Bernie, though, having seen him publicly and talked to him privately about this, is that I do believe he sees himself as part of a larger struggle. I think every candidate should. I think we should view every candidate in that light as a colleague and not somebody to whom we outsource our own judgment and values. You get what I'm saying?
100%. In fact, you're exactly right. I've always, I had the privilege of interviewing Bernie Sanders as he was thinking about running for president. That happens just in the last week. I've also interviewed Sherrod Brown, who I think is a remarkable figure. I have had a chance to interview and be around Elizabeth Warren. I have, had, just not long ago, had a decent conversation with, I should not do this. I just say, I've talked to most of them. Okay. And I think that really is a very, very critical test. How do they talk about what they want to do with their candidacy? What I can tell you, and I'm not speaking out of school because I wrote it up in interviews, when I interviewed Bernie Sanders in 2014, when he was thinking of running for president, not when he was running, but he was thinking of it, he said, I won't run if I think it might harm the left, if I think it might harm the progressive movement in this country, if it might harm struggles for racial and social and economic justice, advancing climate change concerns, all these things. He specifically said that. I'm not gonna hurt the movement, right? Now, as it turned out, in many ways, he popularized the movement. He did a lot to, kind of build out knowledge of some of the issues and some of the ideals. He would never tell you that he did it on his own. He would always say, these movements were here. Maybe his candidacy got to focus a little attention on what some people are doing. Well, that's exactly the model you're talking about. But he's not alone in that. We now have a rising generation of people who speak that language. I think Pramila Jayapal is a very good example. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ro Khanna, all people in Congress right now. The new lieutenant governor of my state, Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, a 32-year-old African-American community organizer who's now the number 2 person in the state government of his state. And he's not the only one. There's a whole bunch of these folks, young folks who are moving into remarkable positions of power and authority and come there saying, hold it, I'm not here because of me. I'm not the rock star here. I am part of a movement. And I'll tell you what the number one measure of that is. The number one measure of that is, what do they do when they're not running? Where do they go when they aren't running? If there's a picket line, if there's a union protest, if there's a civil rights protest, if there's a women's rights protest that needs energy and support and amplification and whatever it may be looking for, if these prominent folks, these folks who run for president and for other positions, if they show up for that when they aren't running, pretty good sense that they might have a little bit of commitment to a movement. And many of them, frankly, I've seen more and more, and you speak of Congresswoman Jayapal, more and more people who really are organizers. And the truth of the matter is they're not in politics as traditional politicians. They're in politics because it's an extension of organizing.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's a politician of the future. I hope it is. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But John Nichols, my friend, as always, great to talk to you. I got so much out of it, as I always do, and I hope you'll come back sometime and talk to us again.
I can't wait, brother. I'm working on a new book about the future of the Democratic Party, and I have a feeling we might enjoy the conversation.
I think we will, and I look forward to reading it and talking with you about it. Thanks again, and have a good trip.
You too, brother. Take care.